Hello and welcome back to Dress for Health, Module 4 on the topic of stress. Stress really can be good and bad depending on the volume, the types, and how we respond to it. So in Module 4, we're going to be hitting the subject of stress from a little bit different angle maybe than what you've heard before, and it's really with the intention or focus on turning stress into strength. Some core discoveries. True stress defined. Types of stressors. There's a sugar and stress connection. There's a stress and weight imbalance connection. And we'll talk about the physiology side of our stress response and some strategies called the 5 A's and some more specific tips of how do we turn stress into strength. With more than 85, close to 90% of all doctors' visits are stress related, this topic is super important for us to understand our own body's responses to stress, where our threshold is, how the level of stress matches our coping capacity. Those types of things are more important than just talking about stress as either being good or bad. It's how those stressors impact us or really impact the metabolic health underneath. This slide looks a little chaotic and it's hard to read the words and it's kind of intentional. That's how stress feels. When we think of stress, typically we think of chaos, we think of pandemonium, we think of our lives are spiraling out of control. And that can definitely be true, a true definition. But when we look at two categories, we're really thinking about acute stress. The adrenal glands fire, we're in fight or flight mode, maybe we're in an accident or, some kind of in the moment acute, it's called sympathetic state, adrenaline, all that's acute stressors. Those come and go. Hopefully we don't have a lot of acute stressors. People in the military, people in law enforcement, some of that, emergency medical teams, they can have more acute stress incidences than maybe the average person. But we're really talking about the chronic stress. Then when the adrenal glands are always involved, we're in a constant state of inflammation. Sympathetic mode is turned on and never turned off. And we're talking more about the hormone cortisol, which I'm sure you've heard of, versus adrenaline. So when we're really talking about chronic stressors, that's where the health impact truly comes. Our bodies are really designed to meet the challenge of an acute stress, but they're not designed to be able to take on or carry this chronic stress load over long periods of time successfully or optimally. So in those three categories of stress, we have three types. So under the chronic column, the main one we're talking about in this module here, we're going to hit three different types of stressors. And they fall into these three categories. Since we're a whole person, we have stress that impacts us physically. So it's poor nutrition, food sensitivities or physical stressors, allergies, actual coded disease states, infections, injuries, environmental toxins, and just day-to-day physical responsibilities like finance and keeping up our house and taking care of the kids. And all of those are physical stressors that impact us in our physical bodies. And then we move into the area of a little bit deeper, the more of the unseen stressors. We're talking about psychological stressors. Psychological stressors have to do with the mind, mental, have to do with the emotions, heart, and have to do with the soul and with the will. The psychological soul side of stress has to do with the decisions we make, the emotions we feel, and the thoughts that we think. So it's loss of a loved one, it's the relocation, it's the change of job, it's that relational strife, it's the conflict we have when family members or coworkers, it's caregiving, it's a little bit of financial pressures that tap in from the physical side to the emotional side, it's traumas we've experienced, it's intellectual, maybe you're in college and going through a tough PhD program. That's all psychological stressors. Sometimes those are heavier and weighty and harder to deal with than an infection or than the physical side. And then we get into even a deeper level of the spirit, that connection point we have with eternity as being your created being from the Almighty God. The spirit, that is the true heart that everything springs from. For out of it are the issues of life. So the spirit is anger, bitterness, and guilt, envy, lust, greed, worry, fear, anxiety. Those are spiritual heart issue stressors, maybe as a result of a physical stressor, maybe as a result of a psychological stressor. These are the spiritual stressors, are the ones that we really can deal with on a root causal basis, that have some kind of deep roots, can get deep roots and really affect us psychologically and really affect us physically. It's all intertwined. And it's not that every single physical stressor has a psychological or spiritual link, but many times they do. So the key to turning stress into strength is recognizing when a physical stressor may have a psychological or spiritual root, in dealing with the stress at the root causal point versus just trying to manage the symptoms of it. Because I've heard someone say more than one occasion, it's not so much about what happens to us in life as it is our response to it. So turning stress into strength is going to be key to really restoring our health in all three areas of physical, psychological, and spiritual, the whole person. On this slide is a chart, and it looks a little complex at first, but we'll break it down here. When we're talking about stress, any type of chronic stress in any category, whether it's physical, psychological, or spiritual, the body in a physiological way, biochemical way, responds the exact same. So whether you're going through an infection physically, or a divorce psychologically, or struggling with anxiety or worry or fear spiritually, it has a physical side to it. And the physical side is the stress response that we're going to talk about. So it's progression of an HPA axis dysfunction and cortisol dysregulation. So it's the common progression with chronic stress. So HPA stands for the hypothalamus, which is a gland in the brain, the pituitary, another gland in the brain, and the adrenals, which are sitting on top of your kidneys. You have two adrenal glands that sit one on top of each of your kidneys. So these three glands play a key role communicating a stress response in the body physically that is a result of any of those three types of stressors. The body's response is the same. So on the left side, you'll see a scale of 0 to 70, and eustress predominance. Eustress, just EU prefix, just simply means good. So good stress is that test that's coming up. You went skydiving for your birthday. There's just some stressors involved with that, but it's all good stress. There's a challenge of a new position at work. Those types of stressors are good. They stimulate. And you want that stimulation to get your mind creative, and the innovation coming out, and the drive to succeed, and the responsibility you take on in leading your family or your team at work or whatever it is. The eustress creates this back and forth with your body that is very healthy, and you're able to adapt. You see that green section of adaptation and homeostasis, and you come back to relaxing. Then you come back, then you start working again, you get that stimulation, you solve that problem, you come back to homeostasis. So it's this constant ebb and flow that's a really healthy ebb and flow of stimulation and response. But when you get the stressors start to rise and you start to mount up, more of a chronic stress on top of a chronic stress, you have an infection and you have marital conflict with your spouse, and then you also lose your father in an unexpected accident, and you start mounting up these chronic stressors, and you begin to move from this eustress state out of normal homeostasis where your adaptation meets your stressors, and there's this equal amount of coping and equal amount of give and take, and you're starting to build that level of stress to where it's getting to be acute distress. So now you're in hyper stress mode. Your cortisol's firing constantly. You're starting to resist the stressors, and you're attempting to adapt, attempting to stay on top of it, attempting to stay out ahead, attempting to not feel overwhelmed. And you're starting to, and for a while we can. And maybe you've known someone, maybe you've been there yourself, where the amount of stress you're having to deal with in your life, you're able to match that. And you almost don't feel good physically, mentally, emotionally, if you're not on high stress mode, if you don't have a ton of pressure on you. As soon as you start to unwind, it's like everything starts shutting down, and you really just have to have those stressors in order to maintain even this pseudo homeostasis, because you're in this hyper stress mode. It's called sympathetic dominance, or starting to become distress dominance. And so you're able to keep up that for a little while, but what's going to happen is eventually that chronic stress acute phase is going to start tapering off, and you're going to find that your body's not able to keep up with that same level of stress. And now we're going to have chronic distress. And oftentimes it's at this point in the whole progression that people start self-medicating. And they usually start self-medicating with things that aren't healthy for them. Even if it's simply coffee for a while. Coffee can turn into alcohol. Alcohol can turn into recreational drugs, or something stronger and stronger and stronger that they need in order to prop themselves up and be able to manage the load of stress that they're dealing with. Kind of the self-medicating concept can even be applied to food. Just as simple as something seemingly innocent of needing a certain comfort food all the time, or creating some kind of negative habit that is a piece of their stress response. And we hinder this, what they call a compensatory phase, which really on a lab test, your cortisol numbers look normal. But you know you've been through a ton of stressors in the last 3 or 4, 5, 10 years, and you say, this does not make sense, and I feel so bad. Energy, mental, emotional, mood, weight, all of it's affected, and you have all of these symptoms, but your numbers in the cortisol literal lab range look normal. Well, it's because you're in this compensatory phase, headed down toward the exhaustion phase. The exhaustion is where you can't adapt at all. There is no ability to rise above your stress level at this point and overcome it. So this chart has helped a lot of clients realize where they are on this pendulum of stress response, and how well do we support our HPA axis from a physical standpoint, and how important it is to manage our stress levels and respond to stressors accordingly from an aspect of strength and faith, really, even, versus letting life overwhelm us and responding from a victim mentality or a self-medicating viewpoint, and really letting stress control and overcome our lives. That's what we don't want to do, and we want to prevent that exhaustion phase. So really, until death, we have some ability, even though maybe you find yourself in that exhaustion phase, there's some ways we can support and pull back up and out of that, before our bodies are completely done. So there is hope in every phase. So let's find out what that hope is. Let's look at, practically speaking, how do we do that? How do we turn stress into strength?